Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, MPP Suwon, for bringing this excellent bill. Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to rise today and speak to Bill 79, an act to proclaim the Nanjin Massacre Commemorative Day. Why am I supporting this bill, and what's so significant to remember this tragic event in the human history? Most people remember that the Nazi Hitler's Holocaust committed against the Jewish people, and people know that Japan started World War II, but they do not remember the specifics of the atrocities committed against the Asian people by the Japanese Imperial Army. World War II has also affected me personally as well, Mr. Speaker. The Nanjin Massacre, also known as the Rape of Nanking, was mass murder killing in Nanjing civilians, unarmed soldiers, and that happened in late 1937 to early 1938. This event occurred after the Japanese army invaded Nanjing, which was China's capital at the time. Reports document that the Japanese Imperial Army ruthlessly massacred about 300,000 Chinese, most of them being civilians, with many women and children, and also raped more than 20,000 Chinese women and girls ranging in age from younger than 10 to older than 80. Thousands of Chinese were slaughtered using all kinds of gruesome killing methods. It was one of the most massive inhumane massacres in the history of mankind, Mr. Speaker. Japanese nationalists contend that the death tolls are inflated and the majority killed were resisting Japanese occupation. To this day, pages in Japanese school history textbook deny the fact this massacre actually took place. Because of this, we can still witness heated protests on the street in China. Then and now, the Nanjing Massacre remains one of the darkest events of the last century. What does the Nanjing Massacre mean to the current generation? To the average Canadians, it probably means nothing, and is something they probably have never heard of before. To the average Chinese Canadian, it probably also doesn't mean very much, except that it might be something they have heard from their parents or grandparents. To the Japanese who are under 50 years old, they probably also don't know much about it. For about 60 years, from 1937 to 1997, overwhelming majority of the people in the world outside of China did not know much about the Nanjing Massacre, and most likely they never heard of it before. It was only after Iris Chang in 1997 published her best-selling book, Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II. More people outside of China have heard of the Nanjing Massacre, but it was still a very small minority. For a few months back, I read the testimony of an 87-year-old Chinese woman called Jia Xiuqin. She shared her story of how she survived the Nanking Massacre. It was December 13, 1937, quotation, around 9 or 10 a.m., the Japanese invaded our house. Xia remembered vividly. My father was killed immediately after they broke in. My grandparents, my parents, my sisters, everyone was scared and crying. 7 out of 9 my family members were killed. Only Xia and her then 4-year-old sister survived. I was stabbed 3 times and passed out. When I woke up, I found myself covered with blood, Xia said, with tears in her eyes. Her legs were trembling, but she insisted to stand on the stage for the whole speech. I heard my sister crying, looking for my mom, but everyone else had died. It was not easy for an 87-year-old to travel across the world to the U.S., but Xia made it in order to preserve her testimony to let people know what had happened in Nanjing in 1937. About 15 years ago, I was working very closely with Dr. Joseph Wang. He was here this morning, maybe here today afternoon, the founder of Alpha Education and the Young Center for Geriatric Care, regarded sex slavery, so-called comfort woman, committed by the Japanese Imperial military soldiers during World War II. One evening during that time, I saw a movie about the Nanjin Massacre in one of the downtown Toronto theaters. The movie was a story based on Iris Chang's best-selling book, Rape of Nanking. The movie showed so many ruthless scenes of this massacre, which I do not want to repeat in this house today, Mr. Speaker. I came home late that night, and I couldn't sleep the whole night. Before the Nanjing Massacre took place, Japan invaded Korea on August 10, 1910. The Japanese Imperial military had occupied the Korean peninsula until August 15, 1945. That is 36 years. During this period, Koreans were not allowed to speak in Korean language in public places. Korean students were punished at school when they were found speaking in Korean. Koreans were forced to change their names into Japanese names. Toward the end of World War II, i.e. from 1942 to the end, the Japanese military apprehended roughly 200,000 Korean women aged from age 10 over age 50. And the Japanese imperial soldiers sent these women to the front line in the battlefield and forced them to become sex slaves. Every night, these women were raped by so many soldiers repeatedly. Some women, they have to treat them over 30 military Japanese soldiers. When some of the women got pregnant, they disappeared. And no one knew what happened to these women. It was not just the Korean women. Some of the women were kidnapped from Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and China. After the end of World War II, many of these so-called comfort women refused to go back to their families because they felt so ashamed. Today, many of us got shocked when we learned that Boko Haram kidnapped hundreds of schoolgirls and used them as slaves. That's exactly what happened during World War II to tens of thousands of Asian women for sex slavery. The people in Japan don't know about that part of history because Japanese government does not want to admit that their country has inflicted such a terrible, inexcusable acts toward other human beings. In their history book, this part of history is completely whitewashed. Unbelievable. This part of history is also essentially not discussed in Canadian high school history courses until recently. Why the people of the Western world don't know about this part of history? I think it is a very good question to ask. As a responsible citizen of Canada and of this world, it is our responsibility to acknowledge and commemorate the Nanjing Massacre. It is our duty to teach our future generation the actual facts of this important part of history, and we all have to work very hard so that there is never again another Holocaust, or massacre, or comfort woman, Boko Haram on this planet. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, I'm submitting this statement to the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.